Some words are as light as a breath, but they can destroy a person, and sometimes it's your own father who says them. 17 years ago, he dismissed me. 4 years ago, he sold me out. But today, I'm standing in front of him in a room full of power, forcing him to hear my name, not as the useless daughter he thought I was, but as the one who saved dozens of lives and buried his career. It's strange how a life can be split into two timelines, before the fracture and after. I used to think mine began in a predictable way, the kind of suburban childhood people package neatly into photo albums. But now, standing here in the quiet of my own apartment, I can tell you it began in silence. Not peace, not comfort, silence that pressed into your skin, sat on your chest, and reminded you you were smaller than the space you took up. My name is Emily Carter, 38 years old. I've spent the last decade working in rooms without windows, on missions that don't exist, for agencies that sign my paychecks but never say my name aloud. They call me a dozen things in the field: operator, asset, liaison, but only one name ever stuck: Whisper. Not because I'm timid, but because I've learned the sharpest blade in this world is a word no one hears coming. I didn't choose this life. It grew on me, wrapped itself around the old scars until I couldn't tell where survival ended and purpose began. And if you're wondering why I'm speaking now after years of being invisible, it's because there's a story that's been clawing its way up my throat for too long. A story that began in a place no one would think to look for it. A small town auditorium in Fairmont, Virginia, under cheap lights and the scent of fresh paint. It was spring, but the air inside felt winter dry. The occasion was dressed up as a civic awards ceremony, little plaques for firefighters, scholarships for high school seniors, a few commendations for veterans. Nothing in the program hinted that I would be there. My name wasn't printed, my picture wasn't on the slideshow. That was intentional. In the third row, or aisle seat, sat a man I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. My father, retired Colonel Richard Carter. His posture was the same as always: straight spine, squared shoulders, chin slightly lifted, like the air around him was a test he intended to pass. He'd been invited under the pretense of presenting a community award to a former comrade. I stayed 3 rows behind, plain dark blazer, no insignia, hair pulled back so tight my scalp ached. For years, I'd built my life out of his sightline, brick by brick, word by word, mission by mission. I'd made peace, at least I thought, with the fact that to him, my work would always be paper pushing or just talking. His soldier's world measured worth in scars and medals, in recoil and smoke. My languages, my negotiations, my ability to pull people back from the brink with nothing but my voice, those were invisible currencies. To him, invisible meant worthless. The ceremony rolled on in predictable monotony until an unfamiliar voice cut through the polite applause. We require whisper in the room. 6 words, that was all. The air changed, heads turned, murmurs rippled. My father's chin twitched up, scanning for the name he didn't recognize. I stood. Every footstep toward the aisle echoed more than it should have. My father's gaze locked on me, and I watched the flicker, recognition chasing confusion, colliding with disbelief. He stood as I passed, not in applause, not in warmth, but in the rigid stance of a man obeying protocol when his instincts haven't caught up. I reached the front. No handshakes, no speeches, just a nod from the man at the podium, the kind that carries both command and acknowledgement. Behind me, the room was a vacuum, the applause withheld like a breath. And in that stillness, for the first time in our lives, my father had nothing to say. If this moment feels like the ending of a story, I assure you, It's the opposite. That night wasn't closure, it was ignition. Because what my father didn't know, what no one in that room could guess, was that I had been walking toward this confrontation for more than 2 decades. That every language I learned, every silence I endured, every step I took out of sight had been part of a path leading me right back here. And in ways no one yet understood, he was the reason I had become what I am. You might think that what I wanted in that moment was his approval, or maybe some long overdue apology, but the truth is simpler and sharper. I wanted the reckoning. I wanted him to stand in a room full of witnesses and say the daughter he had dismissed become the proof that his judgment wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong. But to understand why, you have to know where this all started, not at the ceremony. Not even in my first days at the agency. You have to go back to the beginning, before the missions, before the code names, before I learned how to weaponize a whisper. You have to go back to the Carter house on Sycamore Street, where the front door was always locked, the blinds always drawn, and the air always felt like it belonged to him. And that's where I'll take you next. He Day, Everything Broke didn't come with warning sirens or cinematic thunder. It arrived quietly. Like most disasters in my life, sliding in under the door, sitting down across from me, and smiling like it belonged there. It was October. The Virginia air had just turned sharp enough to sting when you inhaled, and the leaves outside the Sycamore Street house had started their slow burn from green to fire. I was 21, barely out of college, still carrying the illusion that I could keep the peace in my family by staying small. My mother had been gone for years. Cancer, not war, and the house felt like it had collapsed inward without her. My father and I didn't talk much by then. Conversations were either transactional, past the salt, the mails on the counter, or edged with critique. He was still working in a consultancy role for the Defense Department, which meant he carried himself like the rank was still sewn onto his sleeves. And I was, well, to him, I was the daughter who'd taken the wrong road. That morning, I'd been in my room, sorting through a stack of grad school applications I wasn't sure I'd send. Languages, cultural mediation, humanitarian aid. It was the only path that made sense to me. I could string sentences together in 5 tongues, catch a dialect shift in the length of a vowel, and hear the shape of a lie before it finished forming. But in my father's eyes, that meant nothing if it didn't come with a weapon in hand. The knock came just after 9, sharp, official. I opened the door to find 2 men in dark suits, their shoes too polished for our cracked porch. "Emily Carter?" the taller one asked. "Yes," I said, already glancing over my shoulder for my father. They flashed credentials too quickly for me to read, but the weight of them was unmistakable. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing past me into the living room like they'd been here before. My father appeared from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, brows drawing down. "What's this?" he asked. The shorter man didn't answer right away. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sealed envelope, and handed it to me. My name was typed on the front in block letters. "You've been identified for linguistic field support," he said. "Overseas placement, immediate availability requested." I froze. This wasn't a job offer. This was a summons. My father's eyes flicked from the envelope to my face, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Not pride, not even curiosity, but suspicion. "You apply for this?" he asked, voice flat. "No," I said. "I don't," but the taller man cut in. "Your work at the university was flagged. Unusual pattern recognition, dialect mapping. We have a file." A file on me. I hadn't even known such a thing existed. My father took a long sip of coffee, then set the mug down too hard on the table. "I told you languages wouldn't keep you safe," he muttered. "Now they're going to get you killed." I wanted to argue, to point out that I hadn't asked for any of this, but the truth lodged in my throat, because deep down I knew this was the doorway I'd been looking for, a way out of this house, out of this silence, out of being half alive in my own skin. The men explained the terms training in DC, rapid deployment, classified work I couldn't discuss. They made it sound urgent, like they'd come to the right place at exactly the right time. When they left, the envelope still unopened in my hands. My father didn't look at me. He just said, "If you go, don't expect me to write you letters." That should have been the end of it, just another wedge driven between us. But the real fracture came 2 weeks later. I'd started the training program, my head crammed with field protocols and encrypted comms procedures, when I got a message through an internal relay. It was short, 4 words: "Your father sold you." I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what that could mean. It didn't seem possible until the details started surfacing. Someone had fast-tracked my recruitment, bypassed the usual vetting, someone who'd stood to gain from my placement in a specific operation overseas, someone with both the clearance and the motive, and there was only one name that fit. I didn't confront him, not then. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe it was a coincidence, a misunderstanding, but a part of me, small, sharp, and buried deep, knew better. That was the day everything broke. Not because I was leaving, not because of the danger I was stepping into, but because I realized that the man who had spent my entire life underestimating me had finally decided I was useful, just not in a way that kept me alive. And I carried that truth with me all the way into the first mission that would nearly kill me. The Carter house was a fortress without the warmth of one. From the outside, it looked like every other 2-story home in Fairmont. White siding, black shutters, a narrow porch that creaked under your weight. But inside, it was a kingdom ruled by my father, Colonel Richard Carter, and his rules weren't written anywhere. You just knew them, the way you know how to breathe. Rule 1, speak when spoken to. Rule 2, don't confuse respect with affection. Rule 3, there's no such thing as good enough. My earliest memory of my father isn't a bedtime story or a trip to the park. It's in him standing in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, watching me struggle to tie my shoes. I was 6. He didn't kneel to help, didn't offer encouragement. He just said, "If you can't get it right, don't do it at all," and walked away. My mother, Diane, had been the quiet counterbalance. Soft hands, a tired smile, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her even in hospital rooms. Lupus had taken pieces of her long before it took her life. When she died, I was 15. My father's grief was indistinguishable from discipline. The day after the funeral, he was in uniform, at the table with a pen in hand, filling out forms like nothing had happened. After she was gone, the house got quieter, but the silence wasn't empty. It was weighted, like every word you didn't say could still be used against you. Meals were eaten in near complete silence, the occasional clink of a fork on a plate louder than any conversation. Richard Carter wasn't a violent man, not in the way people mean when they say that word. He didn't shout unless it was in command, didn't hit, didn't throw things. His power was subtler, more insidious. It was in the way he could look at you and make you feel like you were already failing some unspoken test. He'd grown up in a military family himself, the son of a man who'd fought in Korea and never spoke of it. He enlisted at 18, made his way up through the ranks, and built a career that was as much about influence as it was about service. I think he believed he was preparing me for the world the only way he knew how, by hardening me, but what he didn't understand was that hardness without trust isn't strength. its isolation. There was one other figure in our household, which, though she wasn't family, Margaret Hill, my father's sister. She moved in after my mother's death, ostensibly to help around the house, but she was more like a shadow that whispered my father's beliefs back to me when he wasn't in the room. She'd tell me I should be grateful for his standards, that he just wanted the best for me, as if the best was something you could measure only in medals and titles. The offending party, the ones who would one day become the focus of my reckoning, didn't begin with strangers. They began with blood. My father was the architect of the cage I lived in. My aunt was the reinforcement. And together they created a home where nothing I did was enough unless it mirrored his definition of achievement. But the story doesn't stop at family. There was another layer, my father's network of military friends and associates, men and women who had served with him, who carried the same clipped speech and the same conviction that the only battles worth fighting involved weapons. They'd visit on weekends, and I'd hear their laughter in the living room, the clinking of glasses, the trading of stories where I was never more than a footnote. I remember one evening just before I left for college when one of them, Major Alan Pierce, asked me what I planned to study. I told him linguistics, maybe international relations. He smiled like it was a joke and said, "That's cute. You'll make a great translator for someone who's actually doing the real work." The room laughed. My father didn't correct him. He never did. Looking back now, I see those moments for what they were. Early rehearsals for the day they'd all have to swallow the truth of who I'd become. But back then, I just absorbed them, let them settle in my bones. There was one more rule in that house, though no one ever said it aloud: never outshine the colonel. His achievements were the sun, and you are expected to orbit quietly around them. Any attempt to step into the light on your own was met with a shadow so cold it could snuff out whatever spark you'd managed to find. I lived in that shadow until the day I left for the agency, still half convinced that if I just worked harder, longer, better, maybe one day he'd see me. But as I would learn soon enough, sometimes the people you're desperate to impress aren't just incapable of giving you the validation you crave, they're the very ones standing in the way of it. And it wouldn't be long before I'd find out just how far my father's shadow could reach. People say rock bottom like it's a final destination, like you hit it once and then start climbing back up. What they don't tell you is that rock bottom has a basement. And if you're not careful, you can find yourself living there. Mine came 2 years into agency work. I was stationed in Berlin, running low-profile cultural liaison duties for a joint intelligence task force. The work was unglamorous but necessary: translation of intercepted communications, context reports on political meetings, subtle corrections to prevent misunderstandings that could spiral into diplomatic disasters. I had a small apartment above a bakery, the kind where the smell of fresh bread seeped through the floorboards every morning. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then came Krakow. The operation was supposed to be clean. I was embedded with a small team, posing as humanitarian aid coordinators. Our real goal: to extract a finance officer willing to defect with key intel on a weapons smuggling network. I wasn't there to fight, I was there to talk, to smooth over the tension between our assets handlers and the local intermediaries. But somewhere along the chain, something went wrong. On the third night, a coded message came through our secure channel. Not my alias, not my operative ID, but my real name, Emily Carter, written clearly, no encryption. My stomach dropped. No one outside of Central Command should have had it. I didn't even have time to process before the safe house went hot. Windows shattered, shouts in Polish, then English. Our team lead, Daniels dragged me toward the back exit while gunfire chewed through the plaster. I remember the weight of my breathing mask, the way the streetlights smeared through the rain, and the sound, God, the sound of someone calling my name again, louder this time from somewhere in the chaos. We made it out, barely, but 2 local contacts disappeared that night, and Daniels took a bullet in the leg. The official report would later call it an operational compromise of undetermined origin. But I knew better. That was the second time my name had been used to bait a trap. The first had been subtle, hidden behind bureaucracy. This one was naked, deliberate. When we returned to Berlin, I was pulled from field assignments. Temporary reassignment, they called it, which is bureaucratic for "we don't trust you anymore." I was moved to a monitoring station in Stuttgart, a grey room with no windows, where I spent 10-hour shifts listening to half-broken audio feeds and summarizing conversations I wasn't allowed to hear in full. It felt like exile. Every skill I'd honed, the languages, the cultural reads, the ability to sense the shift in a room, was useless here. I was reduced to typing fragments into a database, my name buried under layers of access codes. My apartment above the bakery was gone. They moved me into a sterile government housing block with walls so thin I could hear the man next door cough in his sleep. I stopped calling home. Not that my father would have answered. The last time we'd spoken was the week before Krakow. He'd called out of the blue, not to check on me, but to tell me a former colleague of his was doing great things in private contracting. The way he said it, I knew he wanted me to ask for an introduction. I didn't. He ended the call with, "Suit yourself," and that was that. In Stuttgart, I kept my head down, but something in me shifted. I'd spent my whole career believing I could earn my way into trust, that if I was precise enough, discreet enough, effective enough, the people above me would see my value. But here I was, discarded at the first sign of suspicion, my name already stained in ways I couldn't scrub clean. That's when I realized I'd been playing the wrong game. The agency didn't run on merit, it ran on leverage, and I had none. For weeks I went through the motions, wake up, work, eat, sleep. I spoke to no one unless necessary. My body was functioning, but my mind was in freefall, replaying every detail of Krakow, every clue I might have missed, every shadow in the corner of the room. I stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a time. Then one night, sitting alone in that suffocating apartment, I found myself staring at the faint reflection of my face in the black glass of the window. For the first time, I saw what my father had always accused me of being: small, unremarkable, replaceable. That's when I hit the basement. Not because I believed him, but because a part of me feared he might be right. It's one thing to survive betrayal from an enemy. It's another to survive it from the people who were supposed to have your back. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing at the exact bottom of my life. And the next move I made would decide whether I stayed there or built something no one could ever take from me again. When you've been shoved into the basement of rock bottom, there's only 2 choices. Let the darkness swallow you or learn to see in it. I chose the latter. Not because I felt strong, but because strength was irrelevant. What mattered was outlasting. The first step was brutal in its simplicity. Stop trying to get back what was taken. The fieldwork, the adrenaline, the quiet satisfaction of walking out of a room, knowing I'd just prevented a war with a sentence, that life was gone, at least for now. The people who had stripped me of it weren't going to hand it back out of fairness. I needed something else, something they didn't know I was building. My shifts in Stuttgart became cover. 8 hours at the monitoring post typing sanitized summaries into a dead-end database gave me plausible routine, but once my login timed out, my real work began. I still had access, albeit indirect, to the network architecture from my field days. Old encryption nodes, legacy relays that no one had officially deactivated. Most were harmless artifacts. A few were golden keys. I started mapping. Not the physical kind, digital cartography, connection logs, signal hops, buried metadata in internal contracts. I worked backwards from Krakow, tracing the breach like it was a blood trail only I could smell. Every path I followed ended up brushing past the same invisible fence. Restricted procurement records tied to a defense contracting shell. I didn't rush. I couldn't. Moving too fast would trip alerts. So I made myself a promise. Small steps, every day, like sharpening a blade one careful stroke at a time. I studied old vendor lists, cross-checked them against names my father had dropped in casual conversations years ago. A few matched, but transformation wasn't just about chasing the truth. I had to reforge myself, piece by piece, into someone who could hold it without shattering. I woke earlier, ran until my lungs burned, until my muscles remembered the tension of fieldwork, rebuilt the strength I'd let drain from my body when I thought my career was over. I added hours to my language drills, dialects I'd only brushed against in the field, idioms that might seem useless until they weren't. And for the first time, I began learning things I'd always left to others. Cyber intrusion protocols, hardware bypass techniques, not enough to become a full tech operative, but enough to close the gaps in my own skill set. If someone thought they could take me down by controlling the channels I worked through, I wanted the ability to build my own. Every now and then, I'd catch my reflection in the darkened monitor after a long night and see the faintest ghost of the girl my father raised. The posture, the jawline, but my eyes, they'd changed. Harder, yes, but also sharper. About 3 months into the self-imposed transformation, I got a message from a name I hadn't seen in years, Evan Cross. We'd run an op together in Tbilisi, a short stint chasing black market military tech. He'd been the tech analyst who noticed a pattern in the serial numbers that led us straight to the source. Sharp, calm, under pressure. He'd trusted me then, without asking for proof. His message was short. We should talk. I have fragments. We met in a Berlin coffee shop with bad lighting and worse espresso. He slid into the booth without preamble, dropped a flash drive on the table. This is from the breach, the one that burned you. My pulse kicked. How? They told you the files were corrupted. They weren't. They were layered. He leaned in, lowering his voice, and the layering signature matches a proprietary cipher used in only one place, Project Halberd. The name hit me like cold water. I'd heard it once before, years earlier, muttered in my father's study during a phone call he'd cut short when I walked in. Evan went on. Halberd was subcontracted to a consultancy with deep clearance. Guess whose name shows up on the authorization chain? I didn't have to guess. I felt the air in the shop press against my skin. If I had still been the person I was before Krakow, I might have asked for an explanation. But the person I was now knew better. My father's name on that chain didn't automatically mean guilt, but it did mean involvement. That night back in Stuttgart, I opened the flash drive. I didn't just read the fragments, I studied them, cross-referenced them against my own map, and there it was. The path from the breach ran through a contract my father had signed, one with a shadow company that could hide 100 sins in plain sight. I didn't cry. I didn't even swear. I just sat there in the blue glow of the monitor, feeling something click into place. I understood now. My father hadn't just underestimated me all my life. He'd underestimated what I'd become when cornered. And for the first time since the basement of rock bottom, I felt the ground under me start to rise. Returning home after years away is never simple, but doing it under the cover of shadows, that's something else entirely. Fairmont hadn't changed much. Same cracked sidewalks, same corner store with the flickering neon sign. But I had, and that difference was my weapon. The agency didn't officially send me back. On paper, I was still in Stuttgart, running low-priority linguistic assessments. In reality, I'd taken my accrued leave and rerouted my own travel, slipping into the States on a civilian passport, no agency affiliation listed. No one in command needed to know I was in Virginia, and no one in Virginia needed to know why. I had a plan, if you could call it that. The kind of plan that wasn't a straight line but a set of converging threads. Evan's data had given me enough to tie my father's signature to the breach that burned me in Krakow. The contract alone wasn't proof of intent, but paired with the operational timing, it painted an ugly picture, and the only way to confirm it was to get closer, much closer. I didn't go to the Sycamore Street house right away. That would have been suicide, strategically speaking. Instead, I booked a cheap apartment above a laundromat 3 neighborhoods over, the kind of place no one looks twice at. I spent the first 3 days just walking the streets, reacquainting myself with the lay of the land, how the light fell at different hours, which side streets still had working security cameras, or which coffee shop kept its Wi-Fi network unsecured. The first time I saw him again, it was almost accidental. I'd been trailing a lead, a contact of his from the old joint encryption task force, when I spotted my father in the parking lot of a private consultancy office. No uniform now, civilian clothes, pressed and perfect as if every crease was a decision. He was speaking to a man I recognized from the background of an old photo, Colonel James Whitaker, retired. The same Whitaker whose name appeared 3 lines above my father's on the halberd authorization chain. They were laughing, not the kind of laughter you share over old war stories. This was quieter, edged with conspiracy. I snapped a photo from across the lot. Neither of them saw me. That night, I broke my own rule and drove past the old house. The porch light was still the same dim yellow. The blinds in the front room still drawn tight. I parked 2 houses down and watched as a shadow moved past the curtains. His shadow, unmistakable in its posture. For a split second, I was 16 again, standing in that living room with a stack of books in my arms, listening to him tell me they were hobbies, not skills. I could have gone to the door, could have knocked and forced the confrontation right then. But timing was everything, and I wasn't here for catharsis. I was here for evidence. Over the next week, I built a routine. Mornings were recon, following the movements of anyone tied to the Halberd project. Afternoons, I'd sit in the corner booth of a cafe that overlooked the street leading to my father's consultancy office. Evenings, I dug deeper into old procurement records using a secure relay Evan had set up for me. I started to see patterns. My father met with Whitaker twice a week. Both times, within 48 hours, a batch of encrypted data moved through a private server in Reston, Virginia. The same server later linked to the breach infrastructure in Krakow. But the biggest shift wasn't in the data, it was in me. Walking these streets again, seeing the world that had shaped me, I realized just how much distance I'd put between myself and the girl who left here all those years ago. I wasn't coming back as a daughter, I was coming back as an operative. And an operative's job is to get the truth, not to get even. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want both. One rainy Thursday, I got my opening. My father left his office earlier than usual, alone, carrying a slim black briefcase. Instead of heading home, he drove to a veterans hall on the edge of town. I followed at a distance, parked across the street. Through the rain-blurred window, I watched him join a table of men. Some I knew, some I didn't. But one face stood out, a contractor whose email signature appeared in the metadata of the breach command chain. It wasn't proof yet, but it was close, too close for coincidence. When he stood to leave, I ducked into an alley, letting the shadows fold around me like they used to on foreign streets. He passed without seeing me. I caught the faint scent of his cologne, sharp, the same as when I was a kid. It hit me harder than I expected. Memory is cruel that way. Back in my apartment, I laid out everything I had on the table, photos, timelines, server logs. The picture was forming and it was damning, but the question still remained. Was my father an active conspirator or just a man too proud to admit he'd been used? Either way, the moment of truth was coming, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. The first crack in his armor didn't come from confrontation. It came from watching him look over his shoulder. My father had never been the kind of man to check his back. He believed the world should clear a path for him. So when I caught him doing it, even subtly, I knew something had shifted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, clear skies, a thin autumn wind cutting down Main Street. I'd followed him from his consultancy office to a small law firm tucked between a bank and a shuttered bookstore. He walked inside carrying that same black briefcase I'd seen at the Veterans Hall. 37 minutes later, he emerged empty-handed. I was leaning against the corner of the bookstore, head down, phone in hand, playing the part of a distracted pedestrian. He stopped mid-stride, scanned the street with a precision I recognized all too well. Slow pivot, eyes skimming doorways, rooftops, reflections in glass. The old soldier in him was awake. For a moment, his gaze passed over me, lingered a fraction too long, then moved on. But I felt it. He'd registered my presence, even if he didn't consciously place me. That night, I took a risk. I walked into O'Malley's, a dim Irish bar on the east side of town, and sat in the booth directly behind him. He was alone, nursing a whiskey. His phone lay face down on the table. I could hear the faint creak of leather as he shifted in the seat. I didn't speak, not yet. Instead, I listened. His breathing was steady, his sips measured. But when his phone buzzed, he answered in a tone I hadn't heard from him since my mother's funeral. Low, tense, stripped of authority. "I told you not to use this line," he said. A pause. The voice on the other end was muffled but urgent. "No," my father said, sharper now. "We're not moving anything until the audit clears. Too much heat right now." Another pause. "No, she's not." He stopped, lowered his voice further. "I said she's not in the picture." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I knew exactly who she was. I waited until he hung up, then leaned slightly toward the aisle and said, "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." He turned, and there it was. The crack. Not a visible wince, not anger, but a flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of a man who had built his life on never being uncertain. "Emily," he said, my name tasting foreign in his mouth, "you shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," I replied. We didn't raise our voices. That wasn't our way. The tension lived in the space between the words. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, straightening in his seat. I think," I said, "I'm finally asking the right questions, and I think you're finally wondering what I know." He studied me for a long moment, then did something I'd never seen. He looked away first. I slid a small envelope across the table. Inside were 3 photographs, him with Whitaker, him with the contractor from the breach chain, and a time-stamped shot of the Veterans Hall meeting. His jaw tightened. "You've been following me. Consider it a family tradition," I said. He exhaled, slow, controlled. "You have no idea what you're walking into." then enlighten me. But he didn't. He slipped the envelope into his jacket, tossed a few bills on the table, and walked out without another word. I didn't follow him this time. I didn't need to. The crack was there now, and cracks only get bigger under pressure, and I was about to apply more pressure than he'd ever felt in his life. There are moments when the world doesn't explode, it inhales. The air tightens, the light sharpens, and you feel the shape of your life press inward like glass warming before it shatters. That's how the day of the exposure began. Not with sirens, with a breath. They called it a security innovation forum, neutral words stapled over a locked room. The venue was Patriot Hall at Fort Hawthorne, a place that smells like waxed wood and old resolve. Invitations had gone out to retired brass, select contractors, and a handful of active duty advisors. My name wasn't on any list. It never was. But my seat was reserved all the same, row 3, aisle, where you can stand without scraping a chair. I arrived early, the way I always do when I'm about to step into a storm. Evan sat 2 rows behind me, dressed like he'd been born in a grey suit. Across the aisle, I spotted Colonel James Whitaker, the old friend whose signature sat above my father's on the halberd chain. 2 seats to his right, Mason Doyle, the contractor whose email handle appears in my nightmares, and front row, center, my father, civilian clothes, pressed, unapologetically precise. He didn't see me. He wasn't looking for me because he'd convinced himself I was not in the picture. A woman I knew only by reputation took the podium, Deputy Director Mariah Sloan. Her voice carried the timbre of someone who had outlived 3 scandal cycles and learned to keep her pulse steady. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Today's agenda is not ceremonial, it's corrective." You could feel the room lean back at that. A few men shifted, as if checking their holsters out of habit. Whitaker folded his hands. My father's jaw moved once like he'd swallowed a small stone. Sloan didn't open a folder. She didn't need one. 2 years ago, an Allied extraction in Krakow was compromised by a layered breach routed through a private server in Reston, Virginia. The breach used a proprietary cipher originating from Project Halberd. This room contains every person whose authorization, payment, or silence touched that system. The inhale deepened. I could hear the building remember how to creak. "Before we proceed," she said, "we need someone present. Bring Whisper forward." 6 words, not shouted, placed. I stood. No one clapped. No one whispered. Even the air decided to listen. My father turned his head as if a magnet had caught the metal in his spine. Recognition didn't hit him all at once. It crawled, then surged. I watched him catalogue me, posture, face, the hair I still pull tight when I need to feel in control. Something in his eyes flickered, readiness colliding with dread. He rose without deciding to. Old training, you stand when a name heavier than yours enters the room. I walked to the front. Sloan stepped aside. She did not offer me the mic. She didn't have to. My presence was the sentence. On the screen behind her, a timeline bloomed, clean white, surgical blue, dates, IP stamps, contract identifiers. The Reston server pulsed like a distant heartbeat. A dotted line ran from a law firm in Fairmont to a consultancy downtown to a procurement terminal logged at 02:13 a.m. 6 months before Krakow. "Authorization chain," Sloan said, and the signatures appeared neat as a confession. Whitaker, Doyle, 2 names I didn't recognize, then my father's. There are sites that cut so clean you don't bleed right away. I had seen that signature before, glowing on my laptop in a dark apartment in Stuttgart, but seeing it here, amplified, undeniable, contextualized, did something different. It stripped the last thread of maybe. A murmur started in the back. 2 words, a name, a prayer. Sloane let it die on its own. She pressed a key. Audio filled the room. My father's voice, recorded in a law office I'd waited outside of 2 weeks ago, flattened by a device Evan had buried in an old thermostat during a maintenance window. "I told you not to use this line," he said on the recording. A pause, then his voice again, lower, more frayed. "No, we're not moving anything until the audit clears. Too much heat. No, she's not. She's not in the picture." Beside me, oxygen thinned. In the middle rows, a contractor coughed like the sound might buy him time. Sloane didn't look at my father, she looked at the room. The audit he referenced was ours. Quiet, thorough. We followed money, signatures, and a cipher pattern that never should have been exported. We found negligence, willful blindness, and in 2 instances, direct collusion. She let that settle. We also found a force designed to be erased. You call her Whisper. I call her the reason that Krakow didn't end in funerals. My father closed his eyes, just for a second, not long enough to hide. Long enough to look inward and discover there was nowhere to go. I didn't speak. The choice not to is a language of its own. "Mr. Doyle," Sloane said, turning, "would you like to tell the room how Reston's server came to host a Halberd-compatible backchannel without a federal audit?" Doyle's mouth opened. He wore a suit that fit like he'd bought it to be respected in. We were assured by senior advisors that expedited deployment was authorized. "Name them," he swallowed. "Colonel Whitaker and retired Colonel Carter." If you've never watched a man try to outrun a sentence and realize the floor is already the end of the hallway, I can't recommend it. It's not satisfying. It's human. Whitaker went very still. My father didn't flinch, which is its own kind of admission. Sloane nodded to the side door. 2 internal affairs officers entered, not in cuffs, not with guns drawn, just with the certainty of bureaucracy. They stood beside Doyle and Whitaker like winter arriving. No one resisted. "You will both follow these officers to provide formal statements. Your clearances are suspended effective now." She paused, then added, "Take your time. Accuracy matters." Civilized shock. Plain, surgical. No shouting, just the sound of futures being itemized. Then Sloane did something I hadn't expected. She looked at my father and invited him to the podium. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice neutral as a ledger, "you have the right to remain silent." He rose. He moved like a man walking into weather he knows he deserves. At the mic, he took 1 breath, too many. "I authorized a framework I didn't vet," he said. His voice found the register I heard at my mother's graveside, stripped of rank. "I trusted recommendations I should have questioned. I expedited access because I believed speed would save lives." His eyes drifted, found me, and didn't look away. I told myself it wasn't personal. It became personal when that breach used my daughter's name. The room didn't gasp. It recalibrated. People rearranged what they thought the story was and discovered it was more complicated and more damning. He continued, "I did not sell my daughter. I did something smaller and in some ways worse. I looked away when the numbers looked right. I valued momentum over scrutiny. I assumed my reputation could stand in for oversight. And when signs surfaced that we were compromised, I delayed the audit because I was afraid," he exhaled, "of being wrong, of being the reason the system cracked, of acknowledging that the line between service and vanity had blurred." He turned to Sloane. "I accept sanction, all of it, but keep her name out of your paperwork." Here was the twist I hadn't prepared for. Not exoneration, not villainy, but cowardice confessing itself in daylight. He hadn't designed the trap. He'd built the doorway and stepped aside for men who did. Sloane held his gaze a second longer than courtesy requires. "Your statement is entered. she said. The record will reflect what is necessary and omit what is not. She faced the room. As of this moment, the halberd procurement chain is frozen. Every document attached to it will be audited. Every clearance will be reviewed. And one more thing. She turned to me. Whisper is no longer a code name without a face. She is Emily Carter. She is the operative whose decisions and voice prevented the Krakow asset from walking into a kill box after this room failed her. You will extend to her the respect you reserve for the people who keep you alive. The sound that followed wasn't applause. It was chairs adjusting, bodies sitting straighter. A collective physical admission that something in the air had changed and it wasn't going to change back. The men who'd laughed at daughters who study language learned the taste of their own words. Major Alan Pierce, the one who once promised I'd be a translator for someone doing the real work, was seated 3 rows back. He didn't hide his face fast enough. He looked at me with something I've seen in interrogation rooms and hospital halls. Regret that arrived late but honest, the kind that makes a person wish their mouth had been smaller yesterday. Whitaker and Doyle were gone by then. My father remained at the podium. He didn't look to me for rescue. He didn't beg the room for understanding. The most shocking thing he did was the most civilized. He stepped away so the system he'd tried to shield could do what it was built to do when it remembers itself. Sloan closed the session with logistics and legalities. I didn't hear them. I was listening to the silence, the way it's no longer felt like a punishment, but a platform. Evan's hand brushed my shoulder as people began to stand, the light returning to its ordinary shape. Breathe, he said softly. I already did, I said. They just heard it. In the corridor outside, my father waited under a framed flag. He didn't reach for me. He didn't try to fold this into a lesson or a last stand. He only said I was wrong, like a man who had finally found the only sentence he'd never been trained to speak. I nodded. There are apologies you swallow whole, and ones you let sit on your tongue to learn their flavor. This was the second kind. Behind us, the room emptied into the day. People spoke my name in full for the first time and learned it fit in their mouths. The mask I'd worn for a decade didn't shatter. It dissolved, washed clean by light I hadn't asked for but had earned. When I stepped outside, the sky was the color of steel warming. The wind off the parade ground carried something I'd never associated with exposure. Relief. I didn't win anything that day. That isn't what this was. I recovered something, and the people who had taken it, by action, by negligence, by joke, felt the shape of that recovery press back on their ribs. That's what civilized shock is. Not spectacle, alignment. Some silences hum louder than applause. The moment after the forum felt like that, an invisible current running through every handshake, every averted gaze, every whisper that didn't think I could hear it. Outside Patriot Hall, the autumn light was sharp enough to show every line in a man's face. People moved in small knots, their voices low, their eyes darting between me and my father, as if proximity might decide which story to believe. The first to approach was Major Alan Pierce, the same man who once told me I'd end up translating for someone doing the real work. His face had the look of someone who'd been punched in the gut but was pretending it was a stomach cramp. Carter, he said, the name awkward in his mouth. I didn't realize. You didn't want to, I said. He flinched. I underestimated. No, I cut in. You dismissed. Underestimation is an error. Dismissal is a choice. He nodded once, as if the weight of that distinction had just landed, then walked away without another word. Across the lot, Whitaker and Doyle were being escorted into unmarked sedans, their expressions locked in something between anger and disbelief. They'd been untouchable for so long that the very act of someone putting hands on their elbows seemed to have cracked their sense of the world. Inside the hall's officer lounge, the temperature had shifted from polite curiosity to barely contained discomfort. Conversations stuttered when I walked in. Some stared openly, others kept their eyes fixed on their drinks as if looking at me might obligate them to acknowledge what had just happened. The first whispers I caught were predictable. 9 languages? What's that worth without a gun? From a logistics captain who'd never set foot outside a safe zone. Probably just lucky in Krakow. From another, softer voice. Then unexpectedly, a counterpoint. She wasn't lucky. She was precise. It came from Captain Ramirez, one of the few younger officers in the room. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the way truth sometimes does, cleanly, without apology. A couple of men shifted uncomfortably. Someone changed the subject to drone trials in Nevada, but the air didn't reset. It stayed charged, as if my presence had turned the lounge into a place where people had to measure themselves against something they hadn't considered before. I found Evan in the corner, leaning against a wall like he'd been there for hours. He gave me that half smile of his, the one that says, "Both I told you so, and I'm glad you proved me right." "You've got a new problem now?" he said. "What's that?" "They can't pretend you don't exist anymore, which means they'll have to decide whether to respect you or try to tear you down." I smirked. "Let them try. I've had worse." Not everyone avoided me. A lieutenant I didn't know approached, folder in hand. "Ma'am," he said, a touch nervous. "I read your debrief on the Baltic packet last year. It helped us flag a pattern we were missing. I just wanted to say thank you." I didn't overplay it, just nodded. "Glad it helped." When he walked away, I saw the look it drew from the men who'd been whispering earlier. Resentment mixed with something they wouldn't name out loud. Because in their world, acknowledgement is currency, and they just watched me earn some without asking. Out in the corridor, my father was still standing under that framed flag. He wasn't talking to anyone. Not a single handshake, not a single attempt at spin. For a man who'd built his life on controlling the room, it was telling. I stopped a few feet away. "You're quieter than usual," he gave a small shrug. "I've learned the value of it." For a second, I saw the edges of a man who understood that silence could be both a weapon and a surrender. I left him there because nothing I could say would do more than what the day had already done. As I walked out into the cold, I realized something. The people who mattered, the ones who made decisions, moved resources, pulled levers, would remember what they'd seen today. The others, the ones who doubted or whispered, they'd either adjust or fade into irrelevance. And that might be the most satisfying revenge of all. I've learned that victory doesn't always look like the movies. There's no slow motion walkaway, no swelling score to tell you the danger's over. Sometimes it's just you, standing in a quiet room, realizing you've survived in a way that leaves you changed forever. 3 days after the forum, I received an official envelope from the agency, black seal, crisp edges. Inside, a single page. My reassignment request had been approved. Effective immediately, I was moving from field operations to a strategic oversight role. Director of Intercultural and Linguistic Intelligence Training. It didn't surprise me. I'd been thinking about it for months, even before my name came out in the open. Fieldwork had given me years of purpose, but it also meant living under code names, existing in shadows, where your only reward was the absence of failure. Now, I wanted something else, something that would outlast me. The new position came with an office in the Northern Virginia campus. Real windows, my own name on the badge. I didn't flinch when someone used it in the hallway. I built the program I wished I'd had when I started, courses on cultural nuance, listening as a tactical skill, the art of decoding more than just words. Some of my instructors were veterans who'd once doubted me. They learned fast that my classroom wasn't for war stories polished into legend. It was for mistakes, for misreads, for the moments we almost lost because someone didn't know what they were hearing. I didn't see my father again for months. Then one afternoon, a small package arrived on my desk, no return address. Inside, wrapped in plain cloth, was his West Point pin, the one he'd worn my entire life, the one he'd once told me was for soldiers, not quitters. No note, just the pin. I sat with it in my palm for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, but it was an acknowledgement, and from him, that was more than I'd ever expected. I put it in the top drawer of my desk, next to my original Krakow mission notes, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the hardest legacies can shift, if only by inches. Weeks later, I walked into my training room to find a new metal plate mounted on the door. 4 words etched in clean lines, the whisper room. I never asked who ordered it. Some acknowledgements don't need signatures. Standing there, I realized revenge hadn't been the point. Not really. What I'd wanted was recognition. Not in the sense of applause, but in the sense of being seen for what I truly was. And now I had that. In the eyes of the people who mattered, and in the quiet corner of my father's respect. That night, I locked my office, walked out into the cool Virginia air, and let myself breathe the kind of breath you take when you've been holding it for years. Revenge stories are supposed to end with someone losing, but the truth is mine ended with both of us gaining something unexpected. Me, my name back. Him, a reason to believe that not all battles are fought with weapons. I still answer to whisper when certain calls come through. I still keep my field kit packed in the back of my closet, but these days I walk between worlds without hiding in either. And when I pass my reflection in a window, I don't see the shadow of the girl who left Sycamore Street. I see a woman who came back on her own terms and stayed. Because the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else's life, it's about building one for yourself so strong, so undeniable, that even those who try to erase you have no choice but to see it.